close your eyes and let the world outside fade away. Tonight, here on Gaming Lore for Sleep, we travel to a land of snow and silence, a place of ancient gods and deeper regrets. This is the story of a ghost, not of a man who died, but of a man who lived with too much death. It is a tale that begins in fire and rage, the clang of Spartan steel and the roar of a forgotten war. But it does not end there. It is a story that journeys through the ruins of Olympus and finds its way to the quiet, frozen woods of a new beginning. This is the story of Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, a god learning to be a man, a father learning to be human. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the weight of the day drift away. As we begin a long and winding journey from wrath to peace, Kratos, the ghost of Sparta, an epic of rage, ruin, and redemption. Chapter 1: The Mortal Coil, the Spartan General's Oath. The story of Kratos is not one that begins with a god, but with a boy born under a pall of prophecy and pain, in the most brutal city-state the world has ever known, Sparta. Here, weakness was not merely a disadvantage, it was a capital crime. From the moment he could walk, Kratos was thrust into the agoge, the relentless and unforgiving training system designed to strip away individuality and forge the perfect, unthinking instrument of war. He learned to march until his feet bled, to fight with wooden swords until his arms screamed in protest, to endure nights of biting cold with nothing but a thin cloak for warmth. He was taught that emotion was a liability, that compassion was a flaw, and that the only virtue was victory for the state. Yet, even among these hardened youths, Kratos was an outlier. His rage was not a learned behavior. It was a fundamental part of his being, a deep, subterranean fire that simmered just beneath the surface of his skin. It was a flaw his instructors struggled to beat out of him, but it was also the very thing that made him the most lethal soldier in his class. This inherent fury, this uncontrollable spark, was both his greatest strength and his eventual damnation. As a young man, his reputation grew with each campaign. He wasn't just a skilled warrior, he was a force of nature on the battlefield. Where other commanders used strategy and formation, Kratos often relied on a terrifying, direct assault, breaking enemy lines through sheer, overwhelming force and psychological terror. His eyes, even then, held a chilling emptiness that promised only death. He became a general, commanding his own hoplite army, his name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. Yet his ambition was a gaping maw that could never be sated. He craved victories that would etch his name not just into Spartan history, but into the very bedrock of legend. This insatiable hunger led him to a windswept, rocky plain and a fateful battle against a vast barbarian horde from the east. The fight was a masterpiece of tactical disaster. His disciplined phalanxes, so effective against other Greek armies, were utterly overwhelmed by the barbarians' chaotic, unpredictable tactics and sheer, mindless numbers. Kratos stood, his spear slick with gore, and watched as his soldiers, men he had trained, men who had shared his wine and his fires, were systematically surrounded, dismembered, and butchered. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the guttural screams of the dying. The triumphant roars of the enemy echoed the death of his command, his reputation, and his hope, cornered against a cliff face with the specter of a humiliating death closing in. He did not pray to the pantheon for salvation. He roared in feral defiance, his voice tearing from his throat raw and ragged. He screamed up at the smoke-choked, blood-red sky, directing his plea to the one deity who would appreciate such raw, untamed fury, Ares, the god of war. Ares, he bellowed, the word a weapon in itself. Look upon this field. See the carnage I offer you. If you grant me the power to destroy my enemies, to grind them into dust, I pledge my life to you. My sword, my soul, my very breath is forever yours. It was not a humble prayer. It was a pact sealed in the blood of his fallen men, a transaction of souls. The very air grew heavy and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The light dimmed, casting an eerie, orange glow over the battlefield. Then, from the pooling blood and viscera at his feet, a pair of blades unlike any in Greece emerged, wreathed in ethereal, hellish fire. They were the blades of chaos. As their chains, searing hot and smelling of ozone and brimstone, wrapped around his forearms, he felt a pain beyond any he had ever known. It was not merely skin and bone being seared. It was his very essence being branded, his fate being irrevocably chained to a divine and destructive will. The pain was immediately followed by a surge of power, so immense it was dizzying. He was no longer a general. He was an instrument of divine carnage, a puppet whose strings were pulled by the god of war. He tore through the barbarian ranks, the blades becoming extensions of his own wrath. They were a whirlwind of molten metal, cleaving men in two, dismembering limbs, and painting the field in a fresh, steaming coat of gore. The battle was won in a matter of minutes, but the man, Kratos the Spartan, was lost forever in that frenzy. He was now the property of the god of war, a slave to the very rage that had saved him. For years, he served as Ares' mortal champion, a herald of destruction who laid waste to any village, city, or army that opposed the will of Olympus. He led his Spartan army across Greece, conquering in Ares' name, his legend growing into a thing of nightmare. He was the perfect, unthinking disciple, his innate rage nurtured, amplified, and given divine purpose by his patron. But Ares, a cunning and profoundly manipulative god, saw a lingering weakness in his champion, his mortal attachments. Kratos had a wife, Lysandra, a woman of fierce spirit who saw the man beneath the fury, and a young daughter, Calliope, whose laughter was the only sound that could momentarily quiet the storm in his soul. They represented a tether to the humanity that Ares sought to burn out of him, the last remnants of the man he once was, to create the perfect, remorseless killer, a weapon devoid of pity or love. Ares orchestrated a damnation so profound, so psychologically shattering, that it would scar Kratos for all eternity. He clouded Kratos' mind with a magical bloodlust and tricked him into attacking a village temple dedicated to Athena. Consumed by the rage the blades of chaos fed upon, Kratos stormed the temple and slaughtered everyone inside, men, women, priests, all while seeing them as enemy soldiers. As the red haze of battle finally faded, the adrenaline receding like a tide, he stood panting in the sudden, deafening quiet of the smoke-filled hall. The air was thick with the smell of incense and iron. He looked down. There, at his feet, lying amidst the carnage, were the broken bodies of his wife and his child. He had been manipulated into murdering his own family. The horror of that moment was a void that swallowed him whole. It was a pain beyond screaming, beyond tears, a seismic shock to his very being that left only a silent, screaming vacuum in its wake. The world lost all color, all sound, all meaning. As was the custom, a pyre was built for them. A village witch, her heart filled with vengeance for the atrocity he had committed, cursed him. She performed a dark ritual, magically binding the ashes from the pyre to his skin. The gray, gritty flakes adhered to him, sinking into his pores, permanently bleaching his flesh a ghostly, haunting white. This was the mark of the terrible burden, a visual curse for all to see. From that day forward, he was no longer a man. He was a ghost, a walking monument to his own unforgivable sin. The ghost of Sparta was born. His service to Ares was over. The rage that had once been directed by the god now had a new, singular, all-consuming target: the gods themselves. Chapter 2: The Servitude of a Ghost, a Decade of Penance. Consumed by a grief that festered into an all-consuming fury, Kratos became a wanderer, a pariah haunted by his past. The gods of Olympus, ever watchful and eternally pragmatic, saw not a broken man, but a weapon of immense power, one whose immense guilt made him utterly controllable. The Olympians, led by the shrewd and calculating Athena, offered him a path to absolution if he served them faithfully for 10 years, performing the dangerous and demeaning tasks they set before him. The nightmares that plagued his every sleeping moment would be lifted. He would be forgiven. It was a cruel and cynical bargain, but for a man haunted by the relentless ghosts of his family, a man who had not known a single night of peaceful sleep since their deaths, it was the only bargain available. It was a thread of hope in an existence of absolute darkness. Thus began a decade of grueling servitude. Kratos became the gods' errand boy, their divine problem solver. His immense power and his desperate need for redemption made him the perfect solution to their every problem. His feats during this time became the bedrock of his legend, a tapestry of incredible violence woven with threads of profound sorrow. He battled the colossal, 9-headed Hydra, a beast terrorizing the Aegean Sea, its venom turning the water toxic. The fight took him across the decks of a burning naval fleet, a chaotic symphony of splintering wood and roaring flames, culminating in a brutal confrontation where he scaled the creature's massive central body and drove the sharpened mast of a ship straight through its primary skull, vanquishing the beast and earning the gratitude of Poseidon. His most harrowing trial was his descent into the Temple of Pandora, a massive, clockwork labyrinth built on the back of the Titan Kronos, who was condemned to wander the desert of lost souls for all eternity. The temple itself was a masterpiece of deadly engineering, designed to kill any who entered. Kratos navigated shifting walls of massive, grinding gears that could crush a man to paste, solved complex puzzles that required the sacrifice of his own life force, and battled monstrous creations, including the deadly Minotaur and the Hecatonkara, a 100-handed beast of pure malice. His goal, the singular focus that kept him going, was the legendary Pandora's box, hidden within the temple's heart. It was an artifact of myth, said to contain the power to kill a god. It was this power he sought to wield against Ares, to exact a price for the life that was stolen from him. Throughout his servitude, he was a pawn in the petty, squabbling chess game of Olympus. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, positioned herself as his mentor, his protector, his only friend among the gods. She spoke to him in calm, measured tones, offering guidance that always seemed to conveniently align with her own political machinations. She needed a leash for her brother, Ares, whose ambition and growing power threatened the delicate stability of the pantheon, and Kratos was that leash. Other gods offered their aid, but always as a transaction. Poseidon granted him the power of his trident to breathe underwater. Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, enhanced the capabilities of his arms. Even Zeus and Hades bestowed temporary boons, small fragments of their power. They were not aiding a man, they were maintaining a weapon, keeping it sharp, oiled, and pointed squarely at their enemies. Kratos accepted their gifts with cold disdain. They were not blessings, but installments on a debt he feared would never be fully paid. He was a slave to his past, and the gods were his merciless, condescending taskmasters. The end of his decade of service arrived when Ares, in open rebellion against Olympus, laid siege to the city of Athens, raining fire and destruction upon its marble temples. The gods, bound by ancient divine law, could not wage war directly on one another. They needed their mortal champion one last time. Athena promised Kratos that if he succeeded in stopping Ares, the nightmares would finally end. His debt would be paid, and he would be free. It was the one prize, the one shimmering mirage of peace, for which he would burn the entire world to the ground. Chapter 3: The Patricide of a God, the Road to Olympus. To defeat the god of war, a mortal needed the power of a god. Kratos' path led him back to the Temple of Pandora, now active and more deadly than ever. A ticking clock of spinning blades and collapsing platforms on the back of a dying titan. His journey through its depths was a dark reflection of his own tormented psyche, a labyrinth of pain, regret, and deadly trials mirroring the maze of his own guilt. He solved the temple's ultimate puzzle, which required a sacrifice, not of strength, but of memory and identity, momentarily relinquishing his weapons and powers to progress. leaving him feeling vulnerable and naked. He faced and defeated the very architect of the temple, a man driven mad by his own creation, and finally reached the inner sanctum where Pandora's box resided. When he heaved it open, he did not find a physical weapon. He found an essence, a glowing, ethereal power. It was the power of hope, which had been locked away with the evils of the world. This power flooded into him, filling him with a strange, warm light, elevating his being to a state where he could finally challenge a deity on something resembling equal footing. The ensuing battle with Ares was a cataclysm that twisted reality itself. The god of war, a mountain of muscle and malice, hurled massive pillars of temples like javelins, conjured legions of undead warriors from the soil of Attica, and created a nightmarish psychic landscape where Kratos was forced to fight endless, mirrored copies of himself. In this mental prison, Ares resurrected the phantoms of the countless people Kratos had killed, forcing him to slaughter them again and again. Each death a fresh hammer blow on his already shattered soul. The climax was a brutal, intensely personal confrontation, stripped of magic and illusion. Using the power of hope he had gained, Kratos wrested control of a massive, sword-like blade from a great statue of Athena, and in a final, vengeful thrust, impaled Ares through the chest. But it was not enough. He used the very blades of chaos, the symbol of his servitude and his damnation, to deliver the final, killing blow, driving them deep into his former master's body. The god of war was dead. A shockwave of pure energy erupted from his falling form, and the power of his godhood, a torrent of divine essence, flowed into Kratos. He felt his mortal shell expand and transform, his senses stretching to encompass the entire world of conflict. He had ascended. He was the new god of war, seated upon a throne of cold marble and dried blood high on Mount Olympus. Kratos discovered the most bitter truth of all. Godhood was not the release he sought. The nightmares persisted, his family's accusatory faces now rendered in divine, high-definition clarity. The gods had technically upheld their bargain, but his guilt was a cancer woven into the fabric of his soul, inoperable by any divine means. He became a bitter, isolated deity, despised by the other Olympians for his crude, mortal origins and his uncontrollable, animalistic rage. He directed the wars of mankind from his lonely throne, his Spartans becoming the most feared army in all of history. But the campaigns felt empty, meaningless. His relationship with Zeus was one of mutual contempt and simmering hostility. The king of the gods had seen the prophecy of his own downfall. A marked warrior would be his end, and he saw that mark, the ashen skin on Kratos. Fear and paranoia, those corrosive emotions, began to fester in the heart of Olympus. The betrayal, when it came, was as inevitable as the setting sun. Zeus, crafting a cunning and cowardly plan, used the Titan Gaia to lure Kratos into a vulnerable position. As Kratos, in a desperate attempt to protect Olympus from a resurgent Titan army, was channeling his entire godly power into the blade of Olympus. The very sword Zeus had used to defeat the Titans in the first great war, the king of the gods struck. Feigning aid, he instead siphoned Kratos' power, weakening him instantly, and then, with a look of cold triumph, ran him through with the blade. "You will never be the leader I am," Zeus sneered, as Kratos felt his divinity and his life force draining away, the light of the world growing dim. His body was cast down from the breathtaking heights of Olympus, a falling star of failure, crashing into the cold, unforgiving waters of the Aegean Sea below. But the ghost of Sparta was not so easily killed. Rescued from the depths and slowly, painfully healed by Gaia, who sought to use him as a pawn in the Titans' own long-simmering war against the gods, Kratos' purpose was reborn, sharper, colder, and more focused than ever before. It was no longer about absolution. It was about annihilation. The mortal who had become a god was dead. In his place was a force of pure, world-ending retribution, and he would paint the skis of Olympus with the blood of his family. Chapter 4. The Scourge of Olympus, a path paved in divine blood. Kratos' survival was the first crack in the foundation of Olympus, a crack he was determined to widen into a chasm that would swallow the entire pantheon whole. His goal was now terrifyingly simple: find and kill Zeus. But to reach the king of the gods, he would have to tear down the entire divine support structure that propped him up. His quest became a grim, bloody procession of deicide, a slaughter of the divine, where the death of each god plunged the mortal world further into a chaotic, screaming nightmare. He was no longer a man or a god. He was a plague upon the heavens, a harvester of deities, and Greece was his field. His first and most profound objective was to defy destiny itself. He was told his fate was sealed by the Sisters of Fate. He was destined to fail against Zeus. His response was to travel to their great temple and seize control of the loom of fate with his own two hands. He fought through the temple's time-bending, reality-warping chambers, defeated the three all-powerful sisters, and took his place at the loom. He physically turned back the threads of time to the moment of Zeus's betrayal, confronting him in the Spartan war chamber where he had been struck down. The battle raged across the colossal, living landscape of the Titan Gaia's back, who, seeing Kratos as a mere tool and a liability, attempted to crush him in an act of brutal, symbolic defiance. Kratos tore the very massive heart from the Titan's chest, using her divine life force to sustain himself, and continued his relentless assault upward towards the summit of Olympus. The death of Poseidon was the first great cataclysm of the fall. Their battle took place as the Titans scaled Mount Olympus. Kratos, now massive in scale, a colossus of wrath, confronted the god of the seas, who charged at him in the form of a gigantic, watery avatar. In a brutal, visceral sequence, Kratos gouged out the god's glowing eyes, shattered his aquatic form with his bare fists, and finally snapped his neck with a sickening crack that echoed across the flooded world, leaving the oceans to rage uncontrollably, swallowing coastal cities and drowning entire civilizations. He then descended into the foul, stinking depths of the underworld to confront Hades in his own domain. The god of the dead attacked him with his own soul-rending claws, weapons that could tear a mortal's spirit from its body. In a vicious, desperate struggle, Kratos wrested the claws from Hades' grasp and used them to tear out the god's own essence, destroying him utterly. With Hades gone, the dead were untethered, left to wander the earth as shrieking, lost spirits. And the rivers of the underworld began to overflow their banks, leaking their Stygian waters into the world of the living. His vengeance was methodical and pitiless. He hunted down and killed Helios, the sun god, tearing the radiant helm from his head and plunging the world into an eternal, sunless twilight, a perpetual state of fear and gloom. He chased down the arrogant, fleet-footed Hermes, the messenger god, taunting him until he could sever his legs at the knee, inheriting his speed and leaving plagues to spread across the land with no one to contain them. He confronted his own half-brother, Hercules, in a brutal fist-to-fist, no-holds-barred brawl in a grand arena, finally beating the mighty hero to death with his own Nemean cestus. He tricked and incinerated the goddess Hera in her own garden, whose dying breath cursed the very air and caused all flora to wither. He was a divine serial killer, and the Pantheon was his list of victims. The final, devastating revelation came when he finally confronted Zeus. Athena, ever the manipulator, threw herself in front of her father to save him, and as she died in Kratos' arms, her form dissipating into golden light, she revealed the terrible, foundational truth. Zeus was his father. This knowledge, rather than staying his hand, only poured fuel on the inferno of his rage. He was not breaking a cycle, he was fulfilling it. He was the culmination of the very patricidal curse that had defined the Greek pantheon for generations. Uranus was overthrown by Kronos, and Kronos was overthrown by Zeus. Now, the son would overthrow the father. The final battle against Zeus was fought on two simultaneous planes. As colossal beings on the crumbling, lightning-wreathed face of Olympus, and within the fragile, haunted landscape of Kratos' own mind, where his guilt and self-loathing manifested as a powerful, shadowy doppelganger of himself. It was only by finally confronting this internal phantom, by accepting the truth of his past, but refusing to be controlled by it, and by fully harnessing the power of hope that had been smoldering within him since he first opened Pandora's box, that he was able to overcome both his father and his own demons. He beat the king of the gods to death with his bare fists, pummeling him relentlessly until nothing remained but a lifeless husk and the fatting echo of thunder. With Zeus's death, the chain of destruction was complete. The power vacuum caused by the systematic annihilation of the Pantheon resulted in the utter, absolute collapse of the Greek world. The skies turned a permanent, starless black. The seas boiled over, creating vast, dead expanses of steam. The land itself trembled and crumbled into the sea. Mount Olympus, the glorious, shining seat of divine power for eons, fell in a shower of marble, gold, and divine lightning. The age of the Greek gods was over. Standing amidst the absolute ruin he had wrought, the air thick with dust and the smell of ozone, Kratos felt no triumph, no satisfaction. He felt a hollow, endless, screaming emptiness. He had achieved his vengeance, but it had cost him everything, including the last vestiges of his own soul. He took the blade of Olympus, the symbol of so much power and pain, and plunged it deep into his own chest, hoping to finally be free. But death, as always, refused to claim the ghost of Sparta. When he awoke, he was elsewhere. The Greek world was a distant, fatting nightmare behind him. His old blades lay discarded in the snow. He turned his back on the past and walked away, into the silence and the stark beauty of a new land, seeking not to build a new legacy, but to bury the old one forever. Chapter 5. The Frost and the Fire, a Father's Burden. The man who emerged in the harsh, unforgiving Norse wilderness of Midgard was a ghost in every sense of the word. He was Kratos, but the identities of the Spartan general and the god of war were personas he had shed like a serpent's skin, hopping to leave them buried in the ashes of Greece. He had come to this land to die, to fade away into obscurity, but instead he found a reason, however terrifying, to live. He met a woman, Faye, a warrior of a mysterious race known as the Giants. With her, he found a fragile, hard-won peace, a silence that was not filled with screaming ghosts, but with the quiet sounds of the forest and the simple rhythms of a life lived with purpose. They built a home. They had a son, Atreus. When Faye died, her final wish was a simple, solemn one, for her ashes to be spread from the highest peak in all the realms. This quest, born of love and loss, became a journey that would force Kratos to confront the monster he had been, and consciously decide the man he would choose to become. He was older now, wearier, his body a living roadmap of scars and old wounds, his beard streaked with the gray of centuries of regret. His awesome power was a secret, a slumbering beast kept on the tightest of leashes, controlled by a will that had been tempered in the hottest fires of regret. He raised Atreus to be a hunter, to be strong, to be self-reliant, to survive in a cruel world. He hid the terrible truth of their divine nature, fearing above all else the corrupting influence of such power, the arrogance and the rage that he knew it could breed. He saw his own destructive fury flicker in the boy's bright eyes during moments of frustration or fear, and it terrified him to his very core. He was determined, with a desperate, grim intensity, to be for Atreus what Zeus never was for him: a protector, a teacher, a father. But his methods were often cold, distant, and emotionally stunted, born from a deep-seated fear of his own horrific history. He often called the boy, boy, struggling to even utter his given name. a symbol of the vast, emotional chasm he himself had dug between them. Their journey to fulfill Faye's last wish quickly spiraled into a conflict with the volatile and dangerous Norse Aesir gods. They were attacked by Baldur, the invulnerable son of Odin, whose relentless, almost joyful pursuit forced Kratos to break his solemn vow of peace and anonymity. To survive, he had to become the ghost of Sparta once more. He wielded the Leviathan axe, a weapon of immense power crafted by the dwarven brothers Brock and Sindri to rival Thor's Mjolnir, with a controlled, deadly, and efficient precision. But when faced with an insurmountable, freezing threat in the deathly chill of Helheim, his past became his only salvation. In a moment of profound anguish and necessity, he journeyed back to the ruins of his life, to the hidden chamber where he had buried his past, and reclaimed the blades of chaos. The moment the familiar, searing hot chains locked onto his arms once more, the hellish fire reigniting, was one of pure agony. He was not embracing his past, he was weaponizing it, channeling the monster to protect the future, to protect his son. This journey was an internal battle as monumental as any he had fought on the slopes of Olympus. Guided by the severed, yet wise and witty, head of Mimir, the self-proclaimed smartest man alive, Kratos was forced to guide Atreus through the boy's own turbulent and confusing awakening to his godhood. When Atreus, sick and dying from the internal conflict of his unknown nature, lay on the brink of death, Kratos was forced to reveal the terrible, bloody truth. He confessed his past, his patricide, the utter destruction of an entire pantheon and the world they ruled. The truth is, I was a god, he stated, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat, heavy with the weight of millennia of bloodshed. I am from a land called Sparta. I made a deal with a god that cost me my soul, and I killed many who were deserving, and many who were not. He feared his son would look at him and see only a monster. Atreus did for a time, his youthful idealism shattered by the graphic reality of his father's sins. But this painful, brutal honesty, once spoken, became the foundation for a new, more complex, and more honest bond. The climax of their journey was the ultimate test of Kratos' hard-won growth. They learned that Faye was a giant, a being of profound foresight, and that their entire quest had been her meticulously laid design to prepare them for a coming, apocalyptic war against Odin and Thor. When Baldur, having survived their previous encounters, finally tracked them down and sought to kill Kratos' mother-in-law, the last surviving giant, Kratos was presented with a clear choice. He could kill Baldur, as was his old instinct, and in doing so, reignite the endless, self-perpetuating cycle of vengeance and deicide. Or he could spare him, show mercy, and walk away. He chose to spare him. He held the broken god down and growled, "The cycle ends here. We must be better." It was a statement of profound change, a renunciation of his entire past life. But when Baldur, incensed and broken, redirected his attack towards Kratos himself, the Spartan was left with no choice. He broke the god's neck in defense of his own life. As Baldur died in the grief-stricken arms of his mother, Freya, she cursed Kratos with a mother's bottomless hatred and swore eternal vengeance, ensuring the cycle of violence would continue, but in a new, different form. In the end, against all odds, they reached the highest peak in Jotunheim and spread Frey's ashes to the winds, fulfilling her wish. The physical journey was over, but a final, staggering revelation awaited them. On a vast, ancient mural painted by the giants, they saw a prophecy depicted not of destruction, but of peace. It showed Kratos not as a destroyer of worlds, but as a father peacefully dying in the arms of his son, who would go on to lead the survival of their people. For the first time in his interminable life, Kratos saw a future not drenched in blood and fire. He saw a legacy of hope, of sacrifice for something greater than himself. He saw that his long, painful story was not just one of rage and ruin, but of profound, hard-fought change. He was no longer the ghost of Sparta. He was a father, and in the harsh, beautiful, and silent lands of the Norse world, that was the only title, the only victory that truly mattered. The god of war had finally found a cause worth fighting for, not out of rage, but out of love. His long war was over. His life, his true life, had at last quietly begun. Thank you for sharing this journey with us on Gaming Lore for Sleep. Your thoughts guide our path. Let us know in the comments which legend you'd like us to explore next. Sleep well and dream of amazing imaginations.